This is Julian Valdivia at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today I'm speaking with
Donald Dewsbury.
All right, Dr. Dewsbury. We're interviewing you for the retired faculty collection, so it's going to be about your how you came to the University of Florida, your work here, and some of the things you published.
Okay.
So the first question I have to ask is, how do you spell your name, so that the transcriber will not want to ruin their lives looking for it?
Dewsbury.
Okay. And can I ask you what year you were born?
1939.
1939. And where did you go, or where were you born?
Brooklyn, New York.
All right. It's a long ways from Florida.
It is.
Where did you go to school for your undergraduate degree?
Undergraduate at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania.
And was that in psychology?
Most of the time. I started out in chemistry, in chemical engineering, then chemistry, and then psychology for my last 2 years.
Okay. And so did you change your major then?
Yeah.
Okay. What motivated you to do that? What brought you to psychology?
Chemistry was not my thing. I found I got more interested in humans and what humans did. And though I was good at chemistry, I got a couple of awards and so on, I wanted to do something that was more, in a sense, relevant, I guess, to use another word. And so what I did was to go into I want to make a change. Where do you go? You go to the psychology office and find out the chairman of the psychology saw my record and thought it was pretty good and asked me if I would do some work in his lab, if I wanted to do that, which I did. And I did some work there for the next semester. And then a new professor came in the next year, and I worked with him, and that was really the start of the whole thing.
Mm. And was it your professors that inspired you to go into the field, or were there figures or individuals in psychology before that made you think that's cool, I want to go towards that?
It started out, I guess, with the individuals, really, and what they showed me and what was there, and got me interested in doing it.
Mm. Are there memorable projects that you worked on in your undergraduate in your undergraduate degree with your professors that you're allowed to talk about?
Oh, yeah, I can talk about it. I can talk about anything. Well, the first one was sort of an unsuccessful one. We had a new professor named John Braun, and he wanted to do some work with rats. Mm. And John had never worked with rats. And so we got these couple of cases of rats in, and he said, well, go ahead, and here's the cages. He had all this stuff. And he said, here, you go ahead and get them out of the cage, put them into the cages, out of the box, put them in the cages. Well, I don't know if you've ever tried to handle a rat, but you go into a cage, a box of a dozen rats, and they're all out there, ready to charge at you, and I didn't know what they would do. I had a heavy glove on, and we were sort of going back and forth. I eventually got around and got them out of the box and got them into the cage. I don't think any got away, certainly not permanently. So that got me going. The project wasn't very good. So then another professor came in, Doug Candland, and he was very good. He had just gotten a degree from Princeton, a postdoc at Princeton, and he's been a lifelong friend ever since then. And he was doing several projects. One was on teaching machines, how you can automate teaching and so on and so forth, which wasn't really what he was interested in, but was what he was assigned to do, really. And then he did a number of other animal projects, and I worked with him, and he was my advisor, and we did a number of projects together. And so that was a very good interaction. Mm. He then, advancing it a little bit, I did well in school, got a couple of awards and so on. But then he recommended me for, I'm getting ahead of myself, I guess, but for the end of the summer, there was a project called the Jackson Laboratory in Bar Harbor, or Bahaba, Maine. And he recommended me for that. So I spent that summer doing work with dogs in Bar Harbor. And the project was designed to determine whether dogs like people. Very difficult project. Anyway, so I don't know if you want me to go into that.
Actually, yeah, I was going to ask, how do you measure whether a dog likes a person or not?
Well, in this case, what they were doing, they had a project at the Jackson Laboratory. They had a grant. There were several very prominent animal behaviorists there over the summer. And they had a facility. The Jackson Laboratory is the largest laboratory in the world for raising inbred strains of mice. But then a little bit away from there, they had a colony of dogs. And they had 5 inbred strains of dogs, inbred breeds, I guess. And they were working with them on various projects. And the fellow I worked with, Walt Stanley, was interested in the interaction of humans with dogs. So he had this was in a converted barn. And so he had the second floor. We had a gigantic tea maze. I don't know how long it was, probably, say 50 feet as a T, in the stem of the T, and then maybe 20 feet on either side. And you'd have to see if the dog would go to the left side or the right side. It's a tea maze. And so the object was to have one side be one result and the other side be a different result. And most of the time, one side was empty and it would vary from left to right. And the other side had even a person, usually a person in it. And so it seems pretty simple. You want to have you had a start box, and the dog would run down or walk down, whatever, to the choice point and go left or right. And if there was a person in it, usually they would go toward the person, and you study, you make all kinds of data. That's what psychologists do. Show them learning to go to the left side or the right side. And that's what they did, and what we did in the summer. We used with 2 breeds, the Shetland sheepdogs, or Shelties, and the wire-haired terriers. The Shelties are sort of normal dogs, and they would learn that they go down and they interact with the person, and usually they get in there and sort of lick the person and so on and so forth. The wire hairs are a different story. They are very hyper animals, and they would go running down. And the facility was a converted barn, and it had a very slick wooden floor, and they would go down there and they'd slide the last bit and go over there, and the poor person who was sitting there, they would jump on the person. Now, there are 2 conditions. Either it would be a passive person or an active person. The active person would pet them if they could, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, this wire-haired is all over the person, slobbering on them, and so on and so forth, and being very interactive. So that was basically the project, a couple variations, but that was the gist of it. And that was fun. It was a good project. They were doing other projects at the lab at the same time. One woman was doing a study of the effect of nipple licking on the dogs. And so they tried to raise some puppies, newborn puppies, without ever giving them experience with licking, which meant they had to feed them with a bottle several times a day, 24 hours a day. So we used to have to go from our dorm. We stayed in a kind of an interesting dorm. You could look out through the sides of the dorm and see the outside, wooden structure. So we'd have to drive out from there, that 10 miles or so, to the dog facility, and she would give them the formula that they needed, the Esbalac, and then we drive back and so on. So that was an experience too. And she turned out to be a very good psychologist later on, Carolyn Kent Rove.
I was curious, did you or any of the other people ever become attached to any of the dogs?
Not really. Well, we didn't have the opportunity to. And no, not particularly. We liked the dogs, but we never wanted to take them home or pet them or anything else. You didn't have the opportunity. They were kept in pens of a group of them, and so there really wasn't the opportunity.
And then I wanted to ask too, because you specified that they were inbred dogs. Why was it important that the animals were
Excuse me.
inbred?
Well, they were interested in that. They were interested in the breeding. This was a behavior geneticist who ran the lab, or two of them, John Paul Scott and John Fuller. And the thing we were doing is a very small part of what they were doing. And they were interested in these different strains. They did a lot of studies on social learning and other aspects. They were very interested in development, how these developed, and so on and so forth, and the differences. One strain was the African barkless Bazenji, which is different from a lot of the others. And so they were interested in the way these animals developed and did a lot of studies about the effects of various factors on their development.
Mm-hmm. And then I was also wondering too, when the dogs would go towards the humans, how did you measure that as like, how did you know that, like, how did you differentiate that between like curiosity and likability? You know what I mean?
No.
Like, because I remember you said that the study was to determine whether or not like dogs liked people.
Basically, that's a crude way of putting it, yeah.
How would you differentiate it between the dog just being curious about the person that is there and then the dog actually liking the person?
We wouldn't. If they go, they go, and that was it. I can get a little bit ahead of myself because Bucknell was more important to me. I did a lot of work there. But this was the summer after I was at Bucknell before I went to graduate school.
I was just curious. And then the other thing I was wondering too was like, what were the like ethical limitations at the time, like that oversaw like how you worked with animals and things like that?
I could go for a long time on that. I served for a while on the animal committee for the American Psychological Association. And there were always concerns of that sort, about what you could and couldn't do and would and wouldn't do. I don't know where to begin. You had to go along with whatever was regarded as the ethical treatments of the time. And they certainly changed over time. I was on the Animal Care Committee of the American Psychological Association back when there was a lot of activity. And I don't remember, I don't have written down the exact time that was, probably in the 80s, I guess, when it got really active. And I happened to be at one of the meetings of the committee in Washington when they had some of these big protests, all like on the Lincoln Memorial, and they're filled with people all the way down and so on and so forth. And they were carrying signs out in front of the American Psychological Association building and so on and so forth. And there are government and other rules. The American Psychological Association have rules, and every person has regards as what they think is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. There's some things I wouldn't do and some things I would do. And everybody has a different view within the context of the ethical principles. I don't know where you want me to go on that, but...
That's fine. I was just wondering about it in general because, like I said, I'm in history. I'm not entirely familiar with the topic,
right.
So I'm just trying to learn a little bit about the subject myself as we go along with this.
Yeah, there's some things you would do with a rat that you wouldn't do with a monkey, and so on and so forth. And if you're not comfortable with that, then you go do something else. And or, you know, it's just... We have a committee on this campus too. I served on years ago. I haven't done that kind of work in many years, but you have to go through a whole committee, and the paper you had to fill out got bigger and bigger over time. And a committee of people from the health center and various other places. There's only some things you could do and some you couldn't do. The medical people seem more comfortable with doing more invasive things than most of us in arts and sciences did. But yeah, it's the way it is. If you're an MD, you can do anything. That's not true. I shouldn't have said that.
That's all right. So after then your summer in Bar Harbor, where did you go after that?
Okay. I guess I don't need to elaborate more on Bucknell. It was a very good experience. It's a very good liberal arts college, and I got involved with student groups and so on and so forth. It was very influential. Before I went to Bucknell, I had to Bar Harbor. I had already applied to and been accepted at 6 graduate programs, and I chose the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. At that point, I thought I might want to go into sociology, and University of Michigan has a lot of different programs in many fields, and so I felt that was a good way to have that option. It was one of the best universities in the country. So I was accepted and went.
And what was the program that you did?
I started out just as a psychology major, and I was assigned to work with a fellow named Edward Walker, and he was in learning, and that's sort of the field I was kind of interested in at that time. He had me do some studies with rats and learning, and he was very interested in the rat's preferences in terms particularly of stimulus complexity and what level of complexity the animal would prefer. Would they like a very simple, plain stimulus, or very complex, or something in between? So in the beginning, I did that work.
Okay. And for your master's, did you have to have some kind of project that was like your own?
I never did a master's.
Oh, you never did? Oh.
You had the option there of bypassing the master's and going right to the PhD. And some of us chose to do that because the master's was really regarded as a consolation prize. You didn't really need it for anything. And so you could just continue on. I went 4 years and was able to complete the program in 4 years and did projects along the way.
I see. Okay, I should have asked then, because I mean that's still the case today. Not everyone gets a master's.
Yeah.
Were any of the projects that you worked on particularly memorable?
I think the work that I did that went to be a doctoral dissertation was memorable in some ways, because not all psychologists work with electric fish.
Excuse me, electric fish?
Electric fish. Electric fish are a variety of species, let's say from South America. There's some species in Africa too. And they have basically 2 features. One is they give off a mild current, shock, around them. And they use that to locate objects. So it sets up an electric field. And if there's something that transfers, that's the word I want, electricity at a different rate, they would get that and they would feel it in the receptor. And they'll be able to locate something, a metallic object or something, by the presence of that object. Others, such as the electric eel, can give out a shock that can stun a horse or something. It's a substantial shock. I didn't work with those. I was able to get a little bit of money to get some animals brought up from South America. The most productive one was an animal called Gymnotus carapo. What we could do is put those in water and introduce different objects. My professor was interested in arousal and the concept of arousal and what that would do. His notion was that learning is best at intermediate levels of arousal. That if you're not aroused at all, or if you're too aroused, you don't learn as well. There's an optimal level that would work well. And so the object was, here's an animal, the discharge frequency varied with what we thought was its level of arousal. So if you put an object in the water, the animal gets aroused and the discharge frequency goes up. And so what we wanted to do was see if the discharge frequency affected the way it learned. Well, I never got to that part in 4 years. Another fellow followed me and did some of that work. But I was able to do a number of things to the animal, nothing really invasive. We did use shock a little bit, but mild. And see how the animal would react to these different things. You drop a metallic object in there and so on and so forth, and study the way in which it worked.
And so it was then your superior's choice to use electric fish and not yours?
Pardon?
Was it your superior's choice to use electric
No, it was
fish?
mine.
Oh, okay.
I went one day to, we had a number of colloquium series there, and I went to a talk in biology, and they had a fellow from New York who was talking about his research on electric fish. And I was sitting there saying, and he tossed off a sentence, by the way, they just change their frequency depending on how aroused they get. And so on, he goes on, it was mine. Hey, they change their frequency with how aroused they get. Well, that was something I was kind of interested in. And I was able to talk, my professor was very good faculty member and very willing to go with crazy ideas. And he was able to support me and to get the tanks in the water and everything else and so on and so forth. Now they had to be kept on a light cycle with the lights off at night and on during the day. Well, the university wouldn't let us put timers in there, so I had to walk 7 or 8 blocks over there every day, twice a day, to turn them on and off. Now, Ann Arbor, Michigan, in January is not a pleasant place to be walking back and forth, but that's what I had to do. So, and it was successful to a point. It got me the PhD, which was the object of the whole thing, I guess. I published a few papers on it. They never were remarkable, but it was successful.
And they weren't interesting to you?
They were interesting to me, yeah.
I'm curious, how did you learn how, because you were saying with like the time cycle and things like that, how did you learn to care for the fish? Were there like instructions that you got when you received them?
Other people worked with some of those fish. They were generally fed live worms, small, mainly mealworms and other things, and what are the brown ones called? I forget. But white mealworms and so on, a couple of species, and you just get them from a supplier. Pet stores have them, and you can keep them and meal and just use them, store. You take care of them the way other people did, and you just build on what other people did, which is what science is all about, really, in many respects.
And then how did you source the fish? Like, who would you go to find South American electric fish?
Well, there was a fellow, I took a minor in zoology. Dick Alexander was a remarkably good animal behaviorist there at the time. But another fellow over there did a lot of work with fish. And John Bardock, who is a character in and of itself, he and another faculty member there, I worked with them to try to find out what ones were there, and they could help identify them. And so you work with several people, and you don't do it all yourself.
You said that John Bardock was a character. Is there a funny story that you remember with him?
Not really. I didn't know him that well. He used to, one of the things he and my professor Walker did was to play, it was a kind of volleyball, pool water, I can't think, a volleyball in a pool, where there's a goal at each end and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Right. I can't think of the name of it.
Yeah.
But they would get in there, and the only rule was you couldn't keep a married man down underwater more than a certain amount of time. They were fairly rough guys. And so he would do that, and we'd talk about that, and so on and so forth. That wasn't quite my cup of tea. But he was a European with a good, you could tell he was a European. He had a charm about himself that many of us don't have. So.
All right. And so I guess moving on from that, once you had your PhD in hand, did you immediately go to the University of Florida? Or?
Oh, no.
Yep.
I didn't know what to do. But the sort of standard was you try to get a postdoctoral fellowship. And so I applied for a postdoc. I originally applied for 2 years. And I didn't think I wanted a whole lifetime in electric fish. So what I wanted to do was make a transition, spend a year doing that while I learn other things. I was interested in animal behavior, and that at that point was what I wanted to do. And that was my career for the next 30 years or so. And so what I wanted to do is go to work with somebody in animal behavior, for electric fish and animal behavior for a year, and then transition to go just animal behavior. So I applied. National Science Foundation, which has been good to me for many years. My research here was supported for 25 years. But I applied to go to Cambridge, where there was a fellow who was studying electric fish, whose name I'm blocking on briefly. It'll come back to me. But anyway, I wanted to go and work with him for a year. And Cambridge also had some of the best animal behavior researchers in the world, literally. Patrick Bateson and Robert Hine, names that are meaningless to you, but were literally top notch. And so what I wanted to do is I could do this fish research and go and learn the animal behavior and do what some of those did. And then go the second year and wind up going to Berkeley and do the other stuff there, which would be my branch to a career in university animal behavior kinds of things. Turned out that the fellow who had the research lab that I wanted to go to was being remodeled, and he couldn't accept anybody for that year. So what I wound up doing was going right to Berkeley the year after my PhD. I worked with a fellow named Frank Beach. Frank Beach was a very interesting man, very colorful man. I seem to be running into colorful men, and more colorful than me, certainly. But Frank accepted me as a postdoctoral student out in Berkeley, and I went there in 1965 and it was going to be originally a 2-year fellowship. I only stayed a year, but it was for 2 years, that's what you did. And that was in the fall of 1965, yeah. And so my wife and I drove out there. We got a U-Haul trailer, filled it up with my Honda 50 in the back and a lot of other stuff, and started out there. Well, the U-Haul was a little too big for our family Valiant, so we got about 5 miles out of Ann Arbor and got jackknifed off the interstate, and a little dent in the car and so on and so forth. We turned around, went back to Ann Arbor and got a smaller trailer, shipped half the stuff out there, and then we drove the rest of the way. A nice drive going out there, go through the national parks and so on and so forth to Berkeley. And at that time, you may not know all about it, but this was the peak of the free speech movement. I just missed the main part of it, but that was the active part of what was going on. Protests of the war. The war was going on, and the peak of the anti-war was just a couple years later, but it was already happening there, and a lot of anti-war movement and so on was going on, and it was a very exciting place to be for that reason in part.
Can you explain for the people listening what the free speech movement was?
Oh, it was a movement basically, I'm not sure why they called it free speech, but it was to protest the government and the war in particular, the war efforts, and I'm trying to think of why it was called free speech, but it was wanting to have the ability to speak freely in protest of the war. And there were marches down Telegraph Avenue, the major avenue between Berkeley and Oakland, and Mario Savio became a nationally known name because he was the leader of this whole thing. And it was a major kind of event. When I came to Florida, it was quiet, you know. They wanted to have one big protest, and a few people showed up, and they had one thing with the military did, and had military guys there that didn't go anywhere. Berkeley was very different. It was things were changing. They changed first on the West Coast, and then gradually went beyond that.
Did you and your wife at the time become involved in the protests at all?
Not really. I was a passive observer. I was sympathetic with it, but never really involved with it. So we would go down and watch the protests, watch the parades, so on and so forth. Frank Beach, my advisor, was a conservative, and we also knew that it was not the way to endear yourself to him. He would have gone with it. He was a very liberal guy, but liberal in terms of what you do. But you knew that was not the way to endear yourself to him. And I could have, but I didn't. I was more interested in doing the research. And then Berkeley was just in general, had wonderful things, restaurants, activities, go over to San Francisco and all, just across the bridge to San Francisco, up to the wine country and so on and so forth. And it was a very lively place in all respects. Recommend going there if you can. Even now, it's not like it was, but it's still pretty good.
I was going to ask whether or not, like how is the environment different compared to, well, I was going to ask compared to like Ann Arbor, Michigan, but also like compared to Florida here.
Ann Arbor was good. It wasn't quite what Berkeley was in that respect, but it was a very liberal, active kind of an area. And that's where sort of things went from Berkeley to Ann Arbor. So they're pretty close. But Berkeley was the hot spot.
Okay.
And I came here and it was totally different. Now it changed later. Later there were real activities here. There were protests on the front of Tigard Hall, and pictures and so on and so forth that I have of that was going on. They did have some problems. A couple faculty members got fired. There was a thing called the Johns Committee that was interested in some of the political activities of the faculty.
You were here for the Johns Committee? You were here for the Johns Committee?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm going to have a lot of questions about that because I've researched the Johns Committee.
I wasn't directly involved with it, but I certainly was around, and the same kind of a thing. I was interested in it and what was going on, so on and so forth. In those days, my office was in Building E, which is right behind Tigard Hall. It's a parking lot now. And so you couldn't really avoid it in some ways. And so that was, I think the Johns Committee was still around. I'm trying to remember exactly, but yeah.
Well, let's start then with when you came to the University of Florida. When did you come to the University of Florida?
Well, I think the Berkeley years were kind of interesting, and that I don't have to go into.
Oh, no. We can talk about Berkeley, and then I have this written down, so we can go later. Let's talk about
I don't know how
Berkeley.
long you want to go, but in terms of time.
I can go,
Okay.
I can go forever.
Okay. I don't think she can, but whatever. There I got interested in doing rat research, which I had done at Michigan, and doing some interesting studies of sort of standard psychological stuff of what people do with rats. We had a group of very good graduate students that I happened to be with. You're fortunate sometimes in being in a group at the right time where you have good colleagues and so on. That was good. And I got more interested in the animal behavior stuff. We had wonderful faculty there. Peter Barler, he was international person, and others there at the same time. They were doing wonderful primate research. Sherwood Washburn was a leader in field research of primates all over the world. And so I was very fortunate to be in an environment, not just the political environment, the academic environment, where there was a lot going on. And I do have to mention one thing. Probably never heard of Carol Dota.
I haven't.
Okay. Over across the bay in San Francisco at that time, this was when they were beginning to, in terms of liberal, having basically topless dancing. And this was unheard of before that. So Carol Doda was the leading topless dancer at the big show at the main street in San Francisco. And so we went over there and had to see Carol Doda. And she came over to campus one day with her top on. And that sort of occupied the whole campus as people came from all over to see Carol Doda. And that was one of the lively times. Berkeley was a very lively place, a lot going on. Well, then I got interested in other species of rodents. The psychologists worked with domesticated strains of Rattus norvegicus. But I got to thinking, with sort of my biology background from Michigan and so on, that there's a lot of other species, and what would they do? Beach worked with mating behavior. And so it was appropriate for me to do something related to mating behavior, but what about all these other species? And so I began to get a few other species from around the Western Hemisphere primarily, and we brought them in. They're a lot harder to work with. They're nastier and so on and so forth. Originally in the main psychology building, which was Tolman Hall. And then Beach had been involved with, Berkeley it's on a hill. And up the hill was a wonderful park, Tilden Park. And they had a laboratory up there for animals. And what Beach did, who spent his career until then with rats, and he got a dog colony. And so there's a nice dog colony up there of beagles. And he was very interested in their development in many respects. So I got wound up around dogs again. And so I wanted to work with rodents, but there was an empty area that Peter Marlowe had used for his birds. He worked with birds of various sorts. And I got to use that area, and I would get some from suppliers to get various species of rodents. And I would be up there studying the rodent behavior. So I had my little Honda 50, and I have to go up there to the thing, which is a few miles away. Well, you go up from the campus to the hill, you don't go direct on the Honda 50 because it won't do it. You have to go all the way around to the next town and so on and so forth. Now, one time I was coming back and making the turn, and they had sand and so on and so forth. I slipped and had a little accident there. Fortunately, it wasn't serious, but you have to be careful going on the hills of Berkeley and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I began doing comparative work. And Beach was a comparative psychologist, studying different species. And that's where I started really getting into the comparative stuff. Mm-hmm. And when I came here, that's what I began to do too. I worked with different species and so on and so forth, and did that eventually around 30 different species of rodents, and compared the way in which they mate and various aspects of that. Where was I going with that? Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask, because you mentioned people that had an influence on you, like Marler, Beach. Did you notice...
Marler with an M, you got that, right?
Oh, Marler,
yeah.
Sorry. I thought it was Barler.
No.
Did you notice that they had a change on your outlook on what you were doing over your time at Berkeley?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Well, really, I think Doug Candland at Bucknell was especially influential. I mean, I said I still have a lifetime relationship with him and see him every once in a while and so on. And he was the one who really got me sort of interested in animal behavior. He wound up spending most of his career doing monkey research. He got a monkey facility at Bucknell, which is unusual in a small university like that. And then the next most influential was certainly Beach. And I went to, in part because I knew what he was doing. I was trying to decide on my postdoc between going to Rutgers University in Newark, the branch in Newark, where they did wonderful animal behavior research, a fellow named Danny Lehrman, and Berkeley, and I decided on Berkeley. And he was influential in many, many ways, and I don't know where to begin on what he does with you. He's just very outgoing, lively man. There are many Frank Beach stories, but he was a very, excuse me, he was very receptive to what I wanted to do. And as long as it had something to do with what he knew about. And turned out his graduate students were very productive people too. And that was he was very influential. I think those two were clearly the most influential of my career.
They were your mentors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were others. Dick Alexander at Michigan, and some people here, and so on and so forth. And the people at Bar Harbor, but those two were the ones that really stood out.
Was there anything else at Berkeley that you wanted to talk about as well?
Oh boy, I could go on for hours on Berkeley and what was happening there. The project I did was successful. It got me going and gave me a direction, so on and so forth. I had a great time. We would be able to drive, even though Dent was still in the car, up to the wine country and down to the Monterey Peninsula, so on and so forth, into San Francisco. If you can't find something to do in San Francisco, there's something wrong with you. And it was a very good time. I don't know where to go from there. There are a couple other faculty members, again, they're outstanding people. I did some work with some other people, took courses with other people, sat in on courses, and so on. It was for 1 year, it was 11 months. It was a very, very productive time. Then I guess the next step was it was a 2-year postdoc, and Beach was a political conservative, and he didn't think that people ought to live off the government for 2 years. You ought to get your ass out of there and go and do some real work. And so he wanted me to leave, and it turns out that he had these other good students in his lab finishing up at the same time. So he told me straight out, that was his first priority. He had to do his students. I was after that. I was second best. And not second best, but that was his responsibility. And I understood that. And so once he got them sort of going, he looked around. I tried a couple places I might get a job. And there was a job here at the University of Florida. And so I applied for it. And I guess that sort of finishes that stage of it.
And so that was only 11 months then, you said?
Yes.
11 months from when you went to Ann Arbor, Michigan.
No, yeah.
And now you're in Gainesville, Florida.
Well, I'm applying for a job in Gainesville, Florida.
Okay.
And I got the job. And I came here for an interview. And we didn't have any air service in Gainesville, so I had to go to Jacksonville. And that was depressing to see what was in Jacksonville. It was a smelly city at that time. It's a lot better now. And I got picked up at the airport by a fellow by the name of Brad Bunnell, no longer on the faculty. And he drove me from Jacksonville into here. If you're living in San Francisco area, and you go through the drive between Jacksonville and here, it's not much. It's
stark.
There's not much there.
Yeah.
And I've never been south of Washington, D.C. before. And you see all of this going on. And that was an interesting drive, just learning what was going on.
What was going on?
Well, not much.
Okay.
There was still some redneck, as they would be called, people around, so on and so forth, the whole atmosphere. I got here, I guess, a year or two after they no longer had the segregated drinking fountains. So I missed that part of it. I don't know what I would have done if that would have still been there, but I didn't see that part of it. But it was right after it. But it was still very conservative. I mean, if they tried to do that thing, I mentioned the military seminar that they had here. There would have been a riot in Berkeley if they tried that. It would just been totally different. But I got here, and they showed me around. They showed me to Building E, which was very depressing. It was an old wooden barracks. and it was in bad shape. But I was told that they were building new buildings, and they did actually have the surge buildings, so-called, were being built out on Archer Road. And I was told that the first one was completed, and the second one would be completed when I got here. Well, I took them at their word, and it turned out it was actually basically true. So they showed me around and what I would have to teach, and so on and so forth, introduced to the faculty members. The faculty members that were here at that time were nothing compared to what I had been around at Michigan and Berkeley. They weren't in that caliber. Mm-hmm. But I would have a facility, what I wanted. I would have the freedom to be able to teach a couple courses, do research I wanted, and be okay. There weren't people knocking at my door to tell me to go to Harvard. It turned out that about a month after I accepted this job, I did get a call from Michigan State to go there. And I'm glad, as it worked out, I'm better off here than I would have been at Michigan State. Michigan State's a fine school, but it was better off here for a number of reasons. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go back a little bit and just ask a couple questions about what you said. You said that Jacksonville smelled. Do you remember what it smelled of?
I don't know. I guess it's paper pulp and whatever that starts that. It's an industrial smell that you can smell. Parts around New York City are the same way, and it's industrial odors and so on. Mm.
And then I was also curious too, who was on your hiring committee, or did they have hiring committees at the time and things like that?
Brad was the main one. And then the chair at that time was a fellow named Willsby Bernie Webb. Mm. And Bernie was the chair of the department. And you could go a whole time on Bernie. He was a very interesting character in and of himself. But there was somebody from outside the department. They did have a couple of ethologists. Now, I haven't used that word. Ethology is study of animal behavior by biologists.
Okay.
And the people I was talking about in Cambridge were some of the leading ethologists of the day. And so they had two of them here. One was in the zoology department, Franz Sauer, S-A-U-E-R, and Saul Kramer, who was in a strange department down in the health center. I went into his lab one time and he had barrels full of different species of crickets. He was interested in the cricket behavior, obviously, and so on and so forth. So I think one of them was on the committee. And I'm trying to think of who else. Well, Fred King. I was around some interesting people. Fred was a very active guy. He wound up as chair of the neuroscience department, which didn't exist at that time, in the health center. But he was a neuroscientist, originally trained as a psychologist, but a very successful psychologist. He worked down there and did found that department, which grew to be a very big department. The whole Department of Neuroscience is a building there and so on and so forth now. He was the one that really got that going, he and another fellow. So that was a kind of an interesting project. I forget where I'm going on it, but they were the main ones involved with it. I can go a long time on Fred King stories or Bernie Webb stories, but.
So what was the year when you came here then?
66.
66.
Now when they took me out to see the surge buildings, they were out Archer Road. In those days, Archer Road from up here, right near campus, to there, which is 3/4 of the way out to the shopping centers out there, that was a 2-lane road, 65 miles an hour. If you drive a Honda, that maximal speed is 42 miles an hour, and driving back and forth several times a day on that narrow 2-lane road, you're taking your life in your hands. But that's what I did, and it worked pretty well. And the buildings out there are a story of themselves. They wound up with 2 buildings, eventually 3 buildings. The front building was occupied by Brad Bunnell, who had hired me, he was a physiological psychologist, and Hank Pennypacker. I don't know if that name's familiar, but he was studying monkeys at that time. He became very interested in programmed learning, and they had a whole programmed learning project on campus, and teaching machines and so on and so forth, and he did that. He was also at that point doing work with squirrel monkeys. And the buildings we were in had fairly standard ceilings, a little bit like this, I guess, bigger panels, but basically like this. Well, the monkeys figured out how you could get up there and be up there in the eaves and so on and so forth, and trying to get up there and catch them was their problem. Fortunately, it wasn't my problem, it was the front building. And that was interesting in and of itself, just the stories of how they would try to get there and get the monkeys back. Anyway, that's an aside.
That's all right.
I've got a lot of asides.
I'm curious, how long did the Honda last you? This is an aside from the research, but the Honda has been with you this
It lasted
whole
me a
time.
while. My wife worked on, first not on campus. She worked out at the Harman Photo for a while and needed the car to go back and forth there. And so I had to take the Honda. And eventually I was able to work mainly on campus and come in here to Building E, and eventually the psychology building got built, and we had animal labs there. So it was only, I guess, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. I don't remember how long we were out at the surge buildings, as we called them.
And the psychology building, this is the one that's by like electrical engineering and stuff like that now. Okay.
Right.
And so what was the first project that you remember working on then when you came here to the University of Florida?
I guess I got some of those non-domesticated species of rodents. I began to get graduate students. We did some other studies with them. Some of them wanted to do physiological studies. I never liked doing physiological studies. And some of them did that kind of work. I did a couple of projects with Brad Bunnell. He was working with hamsters at that point, and mating behavior and so on. We did some of that work. That was a variety of projects, mainly with rodents. I think that through most of my career to that point, now in the 80s, I guess I changed and started doing history of psychology. But up until that point, I worked mainly with rodents. I did a couple of other studies with people who were doing other studies. But it was mainly different species of rodents. I did all these different animals, mainly mating behavior and all kinds of related studies, trying to do for students what people did for me, to try to follow their interests, but also to have my interests. Now I got grants from the National Science Foundation. I was able to renew them, I don't know, half a dozen times to keep it going for 25 years. And so it had to be, if they wanted funding, it had to be something related in some way to what the grant was for, if they wanted to get any money. That was just the way the world was. I was trying to be as liberal as I could, but that was the limit.
And at this time, too, you're also teaching classes.
Oh, yeah.
Well. Was this your first time teaching?
Let me think. Not really. At Michigan, I was a teaching fellow for 1 year, and they recommended that. Even though I had a National Science Foundation fellowship, they recommended that before you get out, you get some teaching experience, because you want to get a job, and you don't want to be thrown into teaching for the first time at your new job. So at Michigan, I taught for a year. I taught introductory psychology, and we had a group of teaching fellows. We also had there a fellow by the name of Bill McKeechee, who was probably the leading person on the teaching of psychology in the world. And that's not an exaggeration, I don't exaggerate. And we had a teaching seminar, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. I don't know if it had much good. I don't think I was the best, most influential teacher in the world, but he was very good. And I got that background, so I had some experience teaching. And that was important. And when you're looking to try to hire somebody, it's good to get somebody who has at least some experience in teaching.
Yeah. Were there any courses in the pedagogy of teaching psychology and things like that?
That's what Bill taught at Michigan.
Okay.
Here we had some kinds of things, but they didn't really ever develop the way they did at Michigan. Michigan was the place for teaching of psychology. It just happened to be there. But I didn't know anything. It just worked out that way.
I mean, you said he was like one of the, if not the leading guys in the world then.
McKeechee was, yeah.
What was his name?
McKeechee.
McKeechee.
MC.
MC.
Keachie. He was also a wonderful softball player.
Oh, wow, okay.
On Sundays, we had softball games. Sunday mornings, there's nothing else to do on Sunday morning. And we would go down to the local field and play softball. Well, it worked out that we wound up most times to play the Gentiles against the Jews. Because it worked out that it was about half the people were Jews, about half were not. So occasionally we had to borrow a Jew or two, but most of the time it was the Gentiles against the Jews playing softball. And that was fun.
Yeah. Were those kinds of activities normal among the faculty, or was that just at Michigan? Or at least, like, in your experience with Michigan, Berkeley, and Florida, like, was it normal for the faculty to get together and do activities like that?
To some degree. I think that's changed. Bernie Webb, when he was chair, used to have parties and so on and so forth, and the department was smaller. The research was not as prominent as it is now. And so we were closer in those days. After that, it began to get more formal and less informal, less not doing those kinds of things as much. And so, it varies depending on the people. When I first came here, we had a lunch group that would go out once a week of people from different areas, and it was the psychology department was built with different areas. We had 6 areas in those days, and it only became crystallized later. But we would go and have friendly lunches and so on and so forth. We had a group who would go, just a smaller group, and would have get together. Holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, so on and so forth. We don't have, well, we may have that. I'm not involved with it if we do. So it's changed over the years. It's gotten much, it's more formal. They're better research. They're doing better work than was in those days. But that's the cost in some ways. You just don't have the,
The environment's just not as social.
Right.
Yeah. I was going to ask too, because I know this also is a dynamic that I've heard of with older professors and things like that, is a lot of the wives also knew each other.
We're the older professors. I'm not older. Okay.
A lot of the wives also knew each other and things like that.
A lot of the
professors'
wives?
yeah.
Yeah. My wife had other interests, and she was not very much involved with the wives. The wives didn't, as far as I know, didn't socialize very much. She was interested in art history, and she took courses in Ann Arbor and did a little bit in Berkeley. And then while she was here, she got a master's in art history. And those were her main interests. And then she eventually wound up working over in the library and had her own interests, wonderful interests in a lot of things. She does a lot with the museums. She now is a docent, so on and so forth, but just different interests from what most of the faculty wives here have. And there wasn't a whole lot of organized activity that I know of in the psychology department while the wives.
You said it was with the library. Was she library faculty?
No.
Oh.
No, and she worked in the archives.
Oh, okay.
And they're now, they weren't originally, but in the second floor of the Library East there, you know where that is, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And she used to work in the stacks and help people and so on and so forth, do the stuff that I'm sure you're familiar with. And I became familiar with when I got into the history.
Well, we'll get to that. I have a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
When you came to UF then, you mentioned the Johns Committee. what was your experience like? How did you learn about the Johns Committee when you first started?
I shouldn't get into that. I didn't have much contact with the Johns Committee. I knew it was there. I knew a little bit. I knew a little bit a fellow by the name of Marshall B. Jones, Bush Jones, who was one of the people that was investigated by the Johns Committee and eventually left the university because of it. I knew it was there. I knew it was very, very different from Berkeley. I knew it existed, but I think their peak activity was before I got here. I got here a little bit after most of that was going on.
Yeah. Did you hear stories from the faculty then about like things that had happened? Because I know, I mean, like beyond that, I mean, like even I think Dr. Carlton too had even, I don't know if he was accused of being a socialist, but I know he was accused of teaching from socialist texts and things like that.
I don't know.
No.
I missed that. So I just afraid I can't help you with that.
That's all right. I was just curious when you had said it. And so when did you become involved with the Animal Care Committee then for the American Association for...
American Psychological Association.
Yes.
I was more involved with the American Psychological Association with time. I've been involved with several professional organizations, a lot. I did a lot of work with them. And I'm trying to remember how I got involved with that, but we have divisions, and there was a division of comparative and physiological psychology. And somehow I raised my hand more often than I should have, and I got asked if I would serve on that committee. It had been founded actually in the 20s, and Frank Beach was one of the people who was very influential in founding it, the fellow who was in Berkeley. And they had this committee, and it wasn't a formal one, I guess, and I was asked to be on it, and so I did. I agreed to serve. I got on more committees than I should have, but that's the way it worked out. And
so, like, from my uneducated perspective, what was the role of the committee? Like, what was your job as a member of the committee?
Well, basically, for the committee that has existed here, we had really two things. One, if people wanted to do an animal study, they had to submit a request. First, they didn't have that when I got here. It was just beginning at that point. And you had to submit a one-page sheet, what you wanted to do. And the committee looked at it, and you weren't going to hang monkeys from the ceiling or anything. And so it pretty much got accepted. Later on, it became very formal. The health center got involved, and the animal protest got involved, and it became a much more formal kind of thing. The other thing we did, I think once a year, was to go around and look at all of the facilities where animals were kept. And you had to ensure that they were kept in the proper way, that the cages were cleaned and they were met standards. The American Association of Laboratory Animal Care, ALAC, has standards. They publish books that get bigger every year about what is the appropriate way to keep a different species of animal and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of animals all over campus. A lot of them built here, a lot in the health center. There were some in those days. I don't think they're out the other side of 34th, out where the Hilton Hotel is, right, that area. I think that's all changed now. And so we had to go around and inspect and be sure that the animals were kept in a way that was acceptable. I don't know where I wanted to go with that, but that was basically it.
I had brought it up. Were there differing philosophies on how animals should be treated on the committee, or did you all kind of have a...
Well, on the committee, yeah, there were different philosophies, because the health center people believed they could do whatever they wanted, and somebody in arts and sciences shouldn't get in their way, to put it crudely. But there were different views of what they ought to do, and so on and so forth. This happened to coincide with the national activities very much, and I got involved in the APA committee, American Psychological Association, on animal care and welfare and so on and so forth. And even there we had different views on the committee. again, I've lost my thought. It happens when you turn 80. It's just...
That's okay. And so at this time, you mentioned that there were also protests going around a lot. Or there were well, not maybe at this time, but later on, there would be protests that would go on about the handling and care of animals.
Oh, yeah.
Did that have any change on the procedures that were happening for experiments that involved?
It had some effect. Largely, you knew people were there, and you wanted to be a little more careful. We had people protesting in front of the psychology building, and we had some break-ins where they came and they stole some rats. And I think what some of them did was release a couple of rats out behind the psychology building. I don't know if you know what a white rat is going to do out in that area, but it's not going to last very long. And it's not a very humane kind of a thing to do. But there were some break-ins. There's some protests in the health center and other places on campus. Well-intentioned. I understand what these people feel. They feel a sympathy with these animals, and that's appropriate. But within limits, with things you can do and things that are just ridiculous. I think we had a couple of people in town who write a lot of letters to the paper and protest here and there and so on and so forth. Some of it was very reasonable, some of it was outrageous, in my view.
While this is all going on, did you or did the department receive a lot of support from the administration?
By and large, the administration was very supportive, and but also we tried to do what we were supposed to do, and I don't think if we went too far, I think they would have been on us. But by and large, I think they were very supportive.
Okay, and so. Is there, because I wanted to kind of transition to talk about you starting to research the history of psychology. Were there any experiments or projects that you were involved in that you want to mention before we moved on to that topic?
I don't know if any particularly stand out. Over my whole career, I published, I have it here, 384 articles of various sorts, comparative psychology and the history combined. And I wrote or edited 18 books. So there's a lot there. And I could go on a lot with what was going on there. Most of it was fairly standard kinds of studies of animal behavior for that period of my career, of animal behavior studies of particularly mating behavior, which is my main interest, and learning and other activities and so on and so forth. Largely laboratory studies. We did go out on a few occasions and observe and or trap animals. Some of the species we wanted to work with, you could trap in the field, and we brought them into the laboratory and studied them. Rodents, I think exclusively rodents.
Where in the, I don't mean to cut you off there, but like where in the field, like Paynes Prairie or like in and around Gainesville?
There was some in Paynes Prairie. The old field mice are species of mice that are on the beaches up at Santa Rosa, up very near in the Florida Panhandle, very near the border of whatever. And we've trapped some there. You get a little Sherman trap, they're called. Put a little bit of food in them and open, and then the animal would go in and the door would close behind them. They'd trigger it. And so we could get those. Around here, we went down to Cedar Key, and what are called rice rats and cotton rats, Sigmodon and Oryzomes, and get them. You have to go down and set the trap, a little bit bigger trap, and then come back the next morning. You had to get down in the morning because they would fry in the aluminum. They were all aluminum, and you couldn't leave them very late. We went down to South Florida and found to get to a species of wood rats, the nasty critters, and they build huts out of wooden logs and so on and so forth. They're about like this, and you have to go in and dig in and and disrupt them there, and they would eventually, you could eventually get them. Some of them would, the Polionotus, up in the Panhandle, what they would do is they're in the beach, and they would build a burrow, and then build their hut in there, and then they would build an escape route. So what you'd have to do is go in and dig, and then they'd have the escape route, and you had somebody else or a couple people there with cloths or something. They would pop out of there, and then you'd have to catch them when they went out that way.
And so who would go on these trips? Would it just be
Graduate
you
students,
and grad students?
me and graduate students, yeah.
And how would you transport the rats? Did you guys just have like a container in the back of a car or something like that? Yeah. Would someone be in charge of like caring for them and cleaning up after them and things like that? Just
Once we got them back, we had caging here, and we had animal caretakers who got paid to take care of the animals. Obviously, with these critters are a lot more difficult to work with. The domesticated Norway rat, a normal guy could handle that. The other ones, you had to be a little careful. You had to know what you were doing, and special kinds of caging, and so on and so forth.
like for the wood rats and things like that.
Oh, yeah. The wood rats would get away sometimes. If they got out of their cage, they were very agile, and they'd be up in the ceiling and so on and so forth. I had a net trying to catch them going around, and so on and so forth.
Were these like day trips too, or would you guys like stay overnight at a place with the rats and things like that?
It depended.
Okay.
We did some work. There's a wonderful facility down in south central Florida, the Archbold Biological Station.
Okay.
And that's a place where they mainly study birds. And it's one of the leading places for the animals down there. And so we would go down there to work with to catch animals, not on they didn't want you to take them from their plot, but right near it. And they have facilities where we could sleep and so on and so forth. Mr. Archbold was a remarkable old man from the American Museum of Natural History, and there's stories about him. But most of the time, like going up to the Panhandle, we'd stay overnight there. Most of them were day trips.
Okay, and then I guess then I wanted to ask then, how did you transition from doing this, working with the rats, and doing your projects here to, well, I mean, you were still here, doing history of psychology?
Okay, well, the history of psychology, the comparative studies were interesting. You do it for 25 years or 20 years, let's say the first 20 years, you got to write grants every few years, and it gets a little tiring after a while. And the ideas I had, I could still write good enough to get a grant, but it became kind of tedious. I didn't have the motivation I had when I first started. For a long time, since the 20s, we had a course in the history of psychology here. Different people taught it. And then in the 70s and 80s, Bernie Webb was the department chair, taught it. And Bernie was an authority on study of sleep, which is what he did. And he had a very nice lab and very well known for his research. And he was, you could go a long time on Bernie Webb stories, but I'm not talking about Bernie Webb, I'm supposed to talk about me and my work. Anyway, Bernie was about to retire, and he needed to have somebody to teach the history course. And he walked into my office and said, "Why don't you teach the history course?" "I don't want to teach the history course. I teach comparative stuff. That's what I know." "Well, we need somebody to teach the history course." I was getting a little bit interested in the history and how this whole thing became, how it got where it is. So I turned him down and thought about it over the weekend. I said, I had enough of this comparative stuff. Maybe it would be interesting to do the history and do something a little different. And so I thought about it over the weekend and went in Monday morning and said, well, maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea. And so what I did, I spent that year teaching, sitting in on his 2 history courses, reading a lot of history and textbooks and so on and so forth. making the transition and gradually phasing down my lab. I had graduate students I had to finish up and so on and so forth. And gradually making the transition, reading more, learning more, and getting involved with the American Psychological Association, so on and so forth. I've been involved with that throughout my whole career in different aspects of it. Been the president of several of the divisions. The APA has divisions, like 60 or so divisions, and I was very much involved with some of those, president of several of them, and got involved in that way. And gradually began teaching the course, phasing down my animal behavior research and getting into doing more and more animal behavior stuff, more history stuff, I'm sorry.
And so, were there any other people besides Bernie Webb, maybe not necessarily that you knew, but like you read their work that influenced you in wanting to become a historian of the field of psychology?
Yeah, well, there's a whole division of the APA, Division 26 of the history of psychology, and I got to know them. The APA has all these different divisions meeting every year in the fall, and I go to their meetings, got to know people, as usual, getting my nose where it didn't belong, and getting involved here and there, and which I sort of do. And there are many of them who were very influential on getting me involved, and I eventually became the historian of several divisions. I was the president of that division, and so on and so forth. So it was a process rather than an event. It just happens that way.
And so what were some of the first things that you researched when you...
Well, I think that if you're doing animal behavior research, and that's maybe how I got into it, in a psychology department, they wonder, psychology department, why are you studying animals? Why aren't you studying people, and so on and so forth? And so I got sort of interested in why that happened. And it happened because of historical events and what happened. So I began to look at how that happened and how animal study got involved with psychology. And that has a lot of manifestations to it. And I did a lot of different studies and so on and so forth of how animal research got involved there. And who was involved, how they were involved, many aspects of it that way. So it's sort of a transition, and that's sort of how it happened. I don't know if there was a particular study at that phase, later there was, but there are many aspects of, one of the things we do a lot on is individual people. And I wound up editing several volumes, co-editing, of the history of people who worked in the field, autobiographical chapters. I got very interested in that. I'm always interested in people and how the people work and how they do that. And so that was part of it. And so I edited 5 volumes on different divisions of psychology, and then of different people of psychology. That was another couple volumes. So I got very interested in particularly the people and what they did and why and how and so on and so forth. I don't know what got me onto this, but I'm drifting. But anyway.
That's all right.
There was a question there somewhere.
I was asking about how, or about like the first kinds of things that you started to research when you became a historian for the field of psychology.
Well, I worked naturally in what I knew the best. And in most of my career, I did history of animal behavior kinds of people and so on and so forth. I wasn't going to go out and do clinical psychology. I didn't know that. But there weren't a whole lot of people doing the history of the kinds of things I was doing. So it was a natural transition.
Which I was going to ask then, is that how, or is this when like you started to kind of research a lot of the work that was done in Orange Park, Florida with primates?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I did a lot of different studies on the history of animal behavior research, and there's many different things. People in psychology did all kinds of historical research, and it was never really pulled together. And I think I was able to do that and make it a little bit more coherent than it was. Then I learned in doing all of that I learned about this facility, and it had been in Orange Park. And it was founded in 1930, and Robert Yerkes was the one who founded it. Now, Robert Yerkes also was one of the leading people in the history of psychology. He was remarkably involved in military psychology, particularly in World War I and World War II. He was the leading guy organizing all these psychological groups to work on war problems. You could write a whole book on just that part of it. There's a little bit in my book, but a little bit. So I saw that part of it, and it was a natural thing to begin to think about Yerkes. Here I'm working on animal stuff, and he did that, and I began to get involved with that, and I gradually more and more, and it finally became a thing where this really merits a whole book, and I think it did. Hadn't been a bestseller, but I think it was worth doing.
In like the little, not the introduction, but the little like letter from the author and things like that, you said that there were a lot of other like little projects that you had done before that didn't really become a book like this. Were there any of those that were particularly memorable that you want to share?
I don't know if I could pick one or two. I mean, I was working in animal behavior studies, and some of those led to articles and autobiographical things. I mean, I write a whole thing on Frank Beach. Frank Beach was a wonderful, important man, the guy I worked with in Berkeley, and I did a lot on him and other people in the field. I mean, Nico Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz were two of the 3 Nobel Prize winners. I mean, these guys are Nobel Prize winners. That's a big deal. And so I wrote chapters and other things on those people. So there was a lot there to do, and I did a lot. So.
Was it hard transitioning from your work in comparative animal psychology? Did I get that right? Comparative animal psychology?
Yeah, whatever, yeah.
To work in historical research? Like the writing style and things like that?
The writing style isn't that much different. I always was a decent writer. Not a brilliant writer, but I wrote fairly freely, maybe too freely. And it wasn't a major kind of a transition. It was a different transition in other ways. You don't get grants for doing that. You get small grants. But it was nice having 25 years of working in the summer. You get summer grant when you're doing animal behavior comparative work. You don't get summer grants for doing history. And so there were a number of things like that. But and the department is less tolerant of it. They want to see you get your grants and write more papers. It's easier to write a lot of comparative psychology papers than to write a lot of history papers. So that made a difference. Yeah, there were changes of that sort. And I had to tolerate being a little lower on the totem pole of the department than I had been because I wasn't doing the more prestigious work. Well, by that time I'd been tenured for 20 years or something or whatever, and it didn't really matter too much. Salary doesn't go up quite as fast, but that's okay by that point.
You were doing what you enjoyed.
Yeah, I enjoyed the comparative work, but it got a little tiring after a while, doing the same thing.
Well, I meant with when you were still doing history, like that was what interested you at the time.
Right.
So
yeah.
The slower pay raises didn't matter that much.
Not as much.
Yeah.
It's still nice to get money, but yeah, I think I'm amazed at some people who can come to a university and spend 30 years doing the same study year after year, and that got to me after a while.
I'm curious too, because you did a lot of interviews for the book. Did you have any interviewing experience before you started doing research for your book, Monkey Farm?
I don't remember. If it was very minimal. I read a little bit about how to do it. a lot of people are very good. You walk into the room and say, well, tell me about your career, and then you go on and on. We had a wonderful woman on our faculty called Molly Harrower, and she used to live in town. She's dead now. And she was one of the most important clinical psychologists of her day. But I walk into her living room with my tape recorder and so on, and, tell me a little bit about your career. Well, an hour later, there are people like that. There are others that you just have to pull their teeth. And it varies, and I think I got better at it with time. And you just learn how to do it and so on. Well, you know what you're doing. Pretty much what you're doing. You have a mix of trying to lead the interviewee where you want to go and not have me talking about the football team, which I could do a little bit, and having person just talk about one project or something. There's an art to it, and you're doing that, and that's what you're going to do a lot more of it. So
yeah. I'm curious because these are like oral histories and things like that.
They are oral histories. Huh?
Did you do work at all with Sam Proctor while
No.
he was here?
No, he wasn't terribly receptive to it. I met him a couple of times, and the fellow who used to work with him, who lived down in East Gainesville, I'm blocking on his name. But yeah, I never really worked with Sam at all.
Did you do any work with any of the people in the history department itself? Like, was there any collaboration there?
Yeah. We used to have a history department that was interested in academic histories and so on and so forth, which unfortunately is no longer here. Fred Gregory was a very interesting historian. I still see him sometime, and he was, trying to think if he was the chair. He might have been the chair, but he did a lot of academic histories and so on and so forth. We had some others who were interested in that kind of field. I mean, and we had a group of people who are interested in history, academic histories, and we used to meet about once a month. Originally, we used to meet down at the Burger King, which was no longer there. It's on University Avenue, right near where the bookstore is. Well, the bookstore isn't there anymore either. But we'd read a book and so on and so forth and discuss it and so on and so forth. And we had a group that worked. Betty Smolkovitis came later, but she is still very much involved, very active in history of biology. And so there were some people. And so it was always a problem if you want somebody to do history of psychology. Where do you get a committee of 5 people to serve on the committee? Well, that was one thing. We got a couple people there.
I'm curious, again, just because I'm an undergraduate, I don't know. I mean, I am a history major, but I'm not entirely, I'd be foolish to say that I know a lot about history. Why is it that academic histories aren't really included in like the history department? Like, I know, like, I'm familiar with the College of Education because I do a lot of work there too, that, like, for example, like the history of education is confined to the College of Education and not College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and under history and things like that. Yeah. Why is there the separation between the history department and academic histories?
I don't know, in part, because you would think, that, at least in psychology, you have a history of psychology course. Most departments don't do that. There isn't really a history of biology course. I don't know if there's a history of chemistry course. There are people who are interested in it, but they don't really do it. And I'm not sure why. I think in part, it's the way the hiring gets done. In psychology, we have 5 or 6 areas. It's 5 now, it used to be 6. There's an area of psychobiology, an area of social psychology, and so on and so forth. Well, you get a job opening. And who you want? Well, social psychologists want to hire another social psychologist. Other people want to hire a biological psychologist. Who's going to speak out for the historian? Nobody. Everybody wants somebody for their area. And I think that's part of it. And that's some aspects of every department where they want to build their area, their empire, if you will. And they're not really interested in diversifying. That's a generalization. It's not completely true. It's an exaggeration. But I think that's a part of it. It's just every once in a while there's a new field, and that happens. The new field will happen, and chemists will all of a sudden get very interested in some aspect of chemistry, and they need to hire somebody in that area. That person will try to build a program, so on and so forth. So that happens. But I think it's part of the sociology of academics, I guess, and how people do it and what they want to build and what they don't want to build. And it's, I think that's a big part of it.
I'm kind of like curious because I'm thinking to myself like stupid arguments that people would make for why not to have this. Like, I'm sure there would be people that would argue like, why would you need to study like the history of psychology when like that work's outdated? Like we don't,
Right.
we should be focusing
Right.
on like stuff that's current and groundbreaking. Why should we be studying the history of psychology?
Sort of two ways to answer that, I guess. Part of it is that the American Psychological Association has requirements that you're supposed to meet to get a PhD in psychology and so on and so forth. And one of them, which is problematic at times, is to know a knowledge of the history of the field. And that was very good because now you had to have a course. Now, people will argue you don't really need to have a course, but that's the way it was generally structured. And so if you're going to need to have a course, you need somebody to teach it, so on and so forth. And so we've been able to use that argument to get somebody to teach the course, and then very often it would be somebody who is a social psychologist or whatever, and they would teach the history course. So you get sort of somebody who really didn't work with it, but they're interested in it. But I think that's a part of it. Now, as far as I know, the American Chemical Association or Society or whatever these other, I don't know if they have that or not. But I think that's part of why psychology has had that. I don't know a full answer, but that's something.
Are you fully retired from?
Yes.
Okay. I was going to ask, was there like a successor to you? Is there a current historian of psychology?
They teach a course. They have somebody, for a while they had somebody from the education school come over and teach it. Now one of the other people in the department in another area teaches a course in history of psychology. Obviously somebody who works in history of psychology doesn't think it's, but they use a textbook. There's loads of textbooks in history of psychology. And they can use that book and slant it their way and so on. And most schools have some kind of a course in the history of psychology.
Okay, well, transitioning from that, I think I wanted to start asking you about your book a little bit more.
Okay.
What brought you to, how did you learn about the Yerkes laboratory in Orange Park, Florida?
Well, doing what I did and reading animal behavior, and Robert Yerkes was an incredibly important person in the field. And I learned about what he did and had this facility up there and got curious about it. And one thing sort of led to another, as they say. And I went up there to look at the facility. By the time I got interested in it, the facility no longer existed. Now if you go to Orange Park, the area where it was still exists. And the building is still there. And some of the buildings that used to be caging for animals are used for other things. And if you go up to, which I was able to get somebody to take me up there, and you can see all the facilities up above the main floor where the material, the structure that used to be used to raise the doors for the monkeys and so on and so forth, those still exist. And some of the people who work there still live in Orange Park. And so it became interesting. I thought, there's something here. There's something that's interesting. This is an important facility, probably in some ways the most interesting, most important facility of that type, who just works with one child. I mean, there are, I guess, centers for clinical psychology and so on and so forth, but I don't know of any for a particular kind of animal or a particular project that you would write the history of. It'd be mainly more applied kinds of things, I guess. And so it seemed to me like it would be worth doing. Of course, I wrote a couple of articles, and that goes and develops and so on.
What was the most significant research to come out of the facility, in your opinion?
Oh, that's always a difficult question. It was really developing a program that worked with these animals. And certainly the first part of it was just keeping them. What do you feed the animals? How do you get them? What do you feed them? What will they tolerate? How do you handle them? So that's not what was intended, but that was a big part of it. Just zoos have monkeys they keep and so on, but that's very different from keeping an animal in a way that you can work with it and study it. So I think a big part of it was just that part of it was really what they were interested in. It was a means to an end, and they were interested in the end, not the means, but that's really a big part of what it was. And then there were all kinds of studies that, one sort or another, that were important. I mean, there were some studies of the development. The Hayes, there were two studies, the Hayes, the main one, where they would get an infant chimpanzee and raise it in their home and study the development. Development is a very important part of psychology. And this way they could study them in a particular way and what they needed, what age they would develop all these aspects and so on and so forth. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to do that. And they got an animal from the facility, which is another story of itself, and raise the chimpanzee and be able to study development of these animals. So it had a lot of different kinds of aspects to it.
I'm curious, when you say like raise them in the home, how did they treat them different from like how did they treat them as like a subject and not like a pet? You know what I mean?
In the main one, they tried to treat it as much like a human child as they could. Obviously, there were some limits, but they would take it around in their car and drive it around and do various things. Obviously, they had to have diapers the whole time and so on and so forth. But they tried to raise them as much as they could and study how these animals, with a very different brain, how these animals would behave and how they would learn, so on and so forth. Are you okay on time? Do you have a problem as to how long you're going to? I think you, okay, I thought you had a time problem. Okay.
Let's see, what time is it?
You may have a tape problem.
It's 1:22. I know at 1:50 you have to go, but
Whenever my alarm goes off,
Okay.
yeah.
When's your alarm go off? 1:50?
pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever. Okay.
But we can keep going after that.
Okay. Go as long as you want.
Yeah. I was curious, in doing the interviews, what were some of the more memorable interviews that you remember doing?
Oh, let's see. There were a lot of them. And I also did, one of the other things I did before I get to that, to answer your question, I did research in libraries. The Yerkes facility had, Robert Yerkes wonderfully was a person who saved every piece of paper. And those all got saved at the laboratory in Orange Park and then got moved when they, in I have it here somewhere. And eventually, and I don't really have it here, let's say I thought I had it there. Eventually, the laboratory was moved to Atlanta, where there's a whole establishment, a whole story in and of itself, of the development of the National Primate Research Program. The federal government set up a program of research centers, and there's some in New England, California, Oregon, so on and so forth. And one of the ones was the Yerkes Laboratory. That was the only one that was a previously existing facility. And so most of the material got deposited up there and it got moved to Atlanta. So I was able to work that. And it turned out that Fred King, who I mentioned briefly earlier, who had been the head of the psychobiology program here, neuroscience program, he was up there as the director. And so he let me go up there and give me access to the copying machine and all the materials and do all I wanted there. Yerkes' personal papers were all in New Haven because he was a faculty member at Yale and then spent his whole career basically at Yale and collaborated here. He did a lot of things before that, but it was basically Yale. So the two biggest collections are at Yale and Atlanta, where that facility was. And there are a lot of other facilities that have some material. Library of Congress has some materials. Archives of History of American Psychology in Akron, I've been on their board for a while, and a number of other places. And so I've been able to visit and work with those papers and also interview people who were in those various facilities. One of the people, Robert Yerkes, had two children. One was Roberta and the other was, I'll think of his name in a minute. He was very much involved with the development of the subways in Washington, D.C. Why can't I think of his name? I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, so I went up and Roberta was in some ways very open, and I got to stay. She was in a retirement home in New Haven and lived up there, and she invited me to go up there, and I was able to spend a couple days, a couple of nights there and talk with her. And I got a lot of information from her about the facility and so on and so forth. And that was very, very useful. And usually I would go to a facility where the person was. Some of them were in Florida. There's some still live in Orange Park. Some at professional meetings. We're still active in behavior analysis group or whatever, and I could go and interview them there. And so I traveled a bit and had people come here and so on and so forth. And so I think the Roberta Yerkes was particularly interesting. She wasn't always fond of the way I treated things. I think in her view, her father could do no wrong. And I was trying to be a little more objective into history, and she didn't like some of what I did, but it was okay. But I was a little too objective for her, I guess. And the people at Yerkes are not always happy with the way I handled it's still running, it's still an active facility, it's got a lot going on. And they also developed then a branch of the Yerkes laboratories out near Atlanta, about 50 miles east of the facility, where they keep the larger animals and so on. They outgrew the facility on the campus there of Emory, and they have a facility out there. And again, people are very protective of the facility that they're responsible for. And I didn't want to trash them, but I wanted to give an objective story as best I could.
Yeah.
And that was not always what they thought. There's a nice statue, I don't think I have it here, a bust of Robert Yerkes in the front of the facility in Atlanta, so on and so forth. But certainly Roberta was an extremely important person. She was the daughter, and she is the one who saved all the papers and had them cataloged. I mean, you go to, some archives are very difficult. She saved them and it all was organized. You want to find anything, it is there, and you can find where it is. Box 73, folder 30, it's all there. And she spent a lot of time doing that. She was an editor in her career, a very important book editor, so on and so forth. So she was sympathetic with that. And she was certainly the most important one.
You mentioned that some of the people weren't happy in your representation of the facility. Do you think that maybe the reason why they felt it might not have been fully represented is because they only got like what is here when there is? I mean, like I'm not familiar with how much was cut out of the book, but like I'm sure there was significantly much more research and writing that did not get into the final copy.
Literally, when I submitted this to a publisher, it was twice this size.
Wow.
They had me cut it in half. And I tried to deal with some of the big publishers, and As you know, I was a Bucknell undergraduate, and Bucknell University Press, Doug Candland, who I mentioned earlier, was able to get it published by Bucknell University Press. That was not my choice, but they took it and the others wouldn't, because it's kind of an obscure kind of a thing, and I can understand that. But I lost my train of thought, but basically, where was I?
I was asking whether, because they didn't feel like the laboratory was best represented in that book. I was
Right.
asking if
Yeah.
maybe that was because so much of it had been cut from the final copy.
Yeah, I think so. But part of it was because they had their own view, and here I'm this outsider who never worked there, and they really wanted, you know, as people, you want yourself to be represented with. You never did anything wrong. Everything was wonderful. Well, it was a wonderful place, which is why I spent the time on it. But it wasn't perfect, and there was a lot of stuff that. And I had stories in there. They didn't like the stories. One was when they moved from Orange Park to Atlanta. They moved the whole facility. They put all the, you can imagine what it'd be like. You got all these apes, mainly apes, a few monkeys and so on and so forth. You got to move them in Florida from Orange Park to Atlanta. It's hot. And they had to do it by truck, of course. So they had to do it by night. And so they hired these big moving vans to go from here to Atlanta. Well, one of the trucks got stopped on the interstate by the Georgia cops. And, you know, what's in that truck? Well, hey, you don't want to see it. It's apes and so on. We want to see that. So they opened the back of the truck, and these apes start howling at them. And the story as I hear it was, close that and get out of my area. I don't want to see you here again. That's sort of the thing that they would run into. So there are a lot of things of that sort. A couple of other stories. I'm sort of off track, but one was one of the apes, when Henry Nissen, who was the second director, he was very good with animals. Talk about there were 5 directors, but anyway, he really got to know the animals well. And he went to look at this one chimp, and he knew the behavior was off, and so on and so forth. And he couldn't figure out what was wrong. He examined the animal seemed healthy. And so he started to walk away, and the chimp sort of motioned him to come back. Moved like that. And so he went and looked at the chimp, and he had a bad tooth. And so he was able to extract and get it taken care of. You can anesthetize these animals and get the tooth taken care of. It's the kind of relationship that these men had with some of, not all, but some of these chimps, and the way they worked with them. One more story, I jotted down a couple of stories, was when they first moved here, they moved to Orange Park, and almost everybody who worked in Orange Park was a Northerner. And you're moving in the 1930s to Florida, no air conditioning, or very little air conditioning. And it was a very different environment. And one of the stories is that a couple of wives had to do the laundry. And so they go to the local laundromat, and they go to do the laundry. And there was a sign over some of the laundries, whites and colored. Do I whitewash over there? My colored wash over there. That's not what the sign meant. That's where the white people did their wash, and not where the colored people did their wash. And so there's a lot of these kinds of stories of the interaction of people at Yale. Yale's a high-class place, and not that Orange Park wasn't, but it was a very different culture that they went. So there's a lot of these kinds of stories floating around about the way the culture shock that took place in Orange Park, Florida, in the 1930s and on, and this one.
I'm curious, do you have any story? Well, I mean, that story was about like the interaction of like race and stuff like that and how that played a role. But were there any like female or black workers or the experience of female or black workers that you can recall in your research and things like that, learning about that?
Well, Yerkes didn't want to hire a black if he didn't have to, as a faculty member. The caretakers were black and the scientists were white. That eventually changed much later. But Yerkes, if you read anything about Yerkes in his career, he was something of a racist. You would call him a racist today. That's extreme, but that's what he was. So there was that certainly dividing line. He also wasn't very fond of hiring women. There were some women working, but it was really after Yerkes' time when we got into there's several very important people who ran the lab after Yerkes, but women were not going to be hired there.
I'm curious because I mean the time that you were working in psychology was kind of like I mean a big changing point for America, at least in terms of like women in labor and things like that.
Absolutely.
Was the like? Could you describe how like the environment kind of changed over time? Like, I mean, I know there wasn't like a point when it's like there are now there are women in psychology and things like that. But like, when did things start to become like more? I guess kind of how they are today. If that makes sense. That's kind of a horrible question.
I know what you're getting at, and in some ways, it's still happening. It hasn't happened that far, really. We had a colleague when I came here by the name of Dorothy Rethling-Schaefer, and I think Dorothy was one of the first, if not the first, women on the faculty here. And she was hired, I have it somewhere, but I don't have it on my head, let's say the 50s. And she, and for a long time, she was the only woman on the psychology faculty. And then Hannie van der Riet was hired, and they gradually more and more. But then, eventually, it became almost a matter of you needed to have a token woman in your department, or several token women in your department. And so women would have the advantage over men because you had to have some women there. That was the idea. You had to show what a wonderful, benevolent department you were by having your women there. That was kind of stupid in a way, but there was a good point to it too. And there were very fine women who then, once it became a little more open, who would go and go to graduate school and eventually got to the point where you really don't have to hire somebody because she's a woman. You can't hire the first person, the best person, and very often now that's a woman. It wasn't in those days. We've had blacks in the department over the years. We had 3 or 4 over the years since I've been here. Most of them either left or were let go because they just weren't doing what they were supposed to do. We have one, Carolyn Tucker, who's a very popular, wonderful instructor, does all kinds of things, one of the top people in our department. But for the most part, it was just a gradual kind of a thing. And most of us would welcome having people of different races and genders and so on and so forth. Not everybody, but almost everybody, really. I mean, psychologists are generally liberal kind of a group. But I don't know where to go with this. This is pretty much the way it happened.
That's my fault. Like again, I said that was a horrible question. I really don't know how to frame a question for that.
Well, it's probably a horrible answer, but you get the general idea of it, I think.
I mean, there's also the situation of, I mean, we're both 2 white men trying to talk about the issues of race and gender and things like that. Which, I mean, that's not that we can't talk about it, but, you know.
Right.
Back to the book. I was curious, one of the questions that I thought of, because, I mean, I know the facility is still running, but did you ever get to interact with primates that were being studied at the facility?
I went and saw them. I went to see the facility. Fred King was a friend from here, and he was the director when I was working on this. And I went in there and so on and so forth. And I did not do any primate experiments. I never did a primate experiment as such. I was able to go up there and meet with them and see what was going on. But I didn't really do the research. There was also several, the later directors were very distinguished people. Carl Lashley was the second director, was one of the most important physiological psychologists in history. I think if you try to get the top 20 psychologists in history, he'd probably be in that group. And he used to live in that area, and there's wonderful stories about Carl Lashley. And then Henry Nissen, who I mentioned, and several others in the transition till it finally wound up in Atlanta, which is a whole other story.
All right. So where we were at, we were talking about the book and the Yerkes facility.
Right.
I wanted to know also, in like trimming down the book, is there anything that you regret leaving out, or that you most regret leaving out? Because I'm sure like everything that you cut out is important, but
in retrospect, there wasn't anything really critical that I had to cut. There was a lot of detail, a lot more examples, cases, and so on and so forth. But I was able to save the gist of it, the essence of it, I think. So.
Okay.
Of course, these are your babies. To cut half of what you put all the effort into, you hate to do that. But, 10 or 15 years later, whatever it is, I don't think the world really misses a lot of that.
And then I was curious too, because I know Gainesville is not nearly as active as Berkeley in terms of things to do, but were there any activities that you got involved in Gainesville, similar to like what was going on in Berkeley? I know you said that you went to like the wine country and things like that. Is there anything that you took a liking to doing here?
Non-academic things?
Yeah, non-academic things.
Well, there's lots of things. I mean, I came here, I didn't expect to stay very long, and I'm still here. So I enjoy a lot of things. I've been a fan of baseball since I was a little boy, and other sports. And I was able to go to spring training games and other games fairly frequently. We got the team down in Tampa or St. Pete, and went to those games, so on and so forth. I liked football, and my son and I used to go to a Tampa Bay game every year. Once a year, we go down to see games there. So I liked sports. I was never very good at it, but I liked that. I've also been very much involved with photography and taken thousands of pictures, I guess. One of the things I have is a picture of, when I go to meetings and so on, I take pictures of the psychologists there. So I have a collection, which I now have, there's an archives in the history of psychology in Akron, and I've donated it there. And I don't know if anybody anywhere has taken more pictures of more psychologists than that collection. Well, I did it for many years. See people stick a camera in their face, and most of them tolerate it pretty well. So I like the photography. And I've been a big opera fan. Now Gainesville is not a hotspot for opera, but I go up to New York when I can, and Orlando used to have some, and I love the Sarasota Opera. They have, every year they have, in the spring they have a sequence of 4 operas, which you can go and see in a weekend, and then in the fall they have one in some years. And I love that. Now, at the point now, I just can't do that anymore. But I did it for 20 or 30 years. And I'm one of the people who can say that I have seen every opera that Verdi wrote and intended for performance. And there aren't very many places where you can do that. And I saw all the versions, except for one version when I had to come back and teach, when several of the operas had multiple revisions and so on and so forth. So that, I had a family. I married and then got divorced and remarried. And so that's been nice. Had a couple of kids. So there's been that.
Did your kids all go to school in Gainesville?
They both went to school in Gainesville. My son went on and got a bachelor's degree at Bucknell, where I had gone, and then got a master's in Washington at, what the heck's the name of the school? American University.
Yep.
And he still works there. He works in D.C. And my daughter stayed here and got a bachelor's degree, and she got a master's through FSU, and she lives in Atlanta now and works in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Do they come to visit often?
Yeah, always once a year at least. My son sometimes twice a year. But they've got their own careers and their own lives, and I don't see them as much as I'd like to, but on the other hand, it gives me a certain freedom that I don't have to worry about. And I know when my dad retired out to San Diego, and so I would visit him on occasion. And I think after a couple of days, I sort of had enough. You know, you like seeing him, you're a wonderful man. Excuse me. But it just, as wonderful as San Diego is and all you can do in San Diego, you know, that's enough.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that way. We get along well, so it works well.
Do you still read a lot on like the history of psychology and things like that in your retirement, or are there kind of other topics that have moved your interest?
I don't read as much as I should. I used to read a lot more. It's just, I don't read as much as I should. I didn't realize that would happen, but it does. After a while, you've done enough. So.
How do you normally spend your retirement now?
Sleeping? No. How do I spend my retirement? I go out to the gym that's out here, and 3 mornings a week I do work out there. There's a retired faculty group, and I go. They have a once a week lecture there over at the Art Museum, and there's also a group of retired people who who go out to Okamic, and they have classes and so on out there. My wife has been very active and was the director of that for a while, and I go and take classes out there sometimes. There's one is an opera class that's been running the whole time, and I go to a lot of those. I still like to go to sports. I used to be season ticket holder for the baseball team. I can't do that anymore, but I go to some games. I used to go to some basketball games, and I had a season ticket to the football team. Got to see some very good games here. Steve Spurrier was here my first year, and others. So I keep active with the sports. And there's other activities. There's a lot going on at the Performing Arts Center. Obviously I have friends and visit and so on. So I keep active.
And then I'm curious too, how has the University of Florida changed? Or is there one quality that you've seen change from the time that you've come here to now?
No. There's been a lot of changes.
Oh, okay.
The first was just sheer size. I don't know how many, 3,000 or whatever it was. I don't remember what it was when I came here. And then it got up to 50,000. And now they're supposedly in the midst of adding 500 new faculty, of which I guess we're about halfway there now. And so that's been a dramatic change. And the buildings, I mean, it's just this building and most of them around here were not in existence in those days. The faculty has gotten much better. Everything has expanded greatly. I mean, size is the big thing. The quality has gotten better. You see the university likes to hammer how we're now top 10 in public universities and so on and so forth. And so everything has grown dramatically, and most of it for the good. Some places it may not have been the best way it developed, but it's developed okay.
I'm curious whether or not, because I know this is something that a lot of professors talk about in general, whether or not you think the top 10 status is a little braggadocious and that there are things that still need changing within a lot of the departments maybe that could improve things still.
Oh, it's never perfect. It always can be improved. I think it's gotten a lot better since I came, certainly. Not because of what I did, but...
Very humble about your accomplishments.
Well, I didn't change the university. I did my little part, and I think I was able to help improve things. But I don't think it's humility. But I'm not sure how I would improve it. The obvious things. You'd like to hire some top faculty and so on and so forth, but I don't think I have anything terribly original and creative to contribute in that respect. It's
have professors become, and this is just, I don't know a lot about the history of the university, but was labor organization like a relatively new thing among the professors when you came? I know there's United Faculty of Florida, and there was also the American Association of University Professors. Was that common when you were here? Like, did professors start to organize after, or?
It was after, but it's never really grown here. I mean, there are places where it really had immense influence. It never has had that influence here. There is the organization here, but I don't know. I don't think the majority of faculty are even members. And it hasn't been terribly influential as far as I can see. Every once in a while there's a labor negotiation of some sort, so on and so forth. Now, I used to give a whole lecture on the history of the university. The first part of it was history of the university, from its founding and so on and so forth, and then through the history of the department. And so I'm familiar with a lot of that, and I don't think there's anything in particular in a short time that I would want to go through, and so on and so forth.
Could I ask that? Because I know, like, with things that, well, they always say don't give a historian a mic at like an event or something like that, but I'm curious with the history of the psychology department. Could you give me like a little intro to that? Because I mean, like, I have no idea about how psychology even came to the University of Florida and things like that.
Well, I used to teach that. I haven't looked at my notes on that in years. But back in the first part of the century, psychology was becoming prominent, and they had somebody who taught a course in the history of psychology, didn't do too much of it, and so on and so forth, mainly people from philosophy. And then we had a fellow, I haven't prepared for this, who was the chair, who was an undergraduate here. He was a very important undergraduate. He was the head of Blue Key and all that kind of stuff. And he made a deal with the dean that if he goes off and gets a PhD in psychology, they would found a department and have him as the chair. And so he went off and he got the PhD, came back here for a couple of years before he finally did the exams and completed it. And then he founded this psychology department in 1930. I'm pretty sure it was 1930. And they had a department of about 3 people and so on and so forth. And they taught the undergraduates and it wasn't a very potent department, but it existed. And they did what everybody does in that kind of a small department, I guess. And then they got a dean here, and in the 1950s, decided that they needed to do something more substantial and get somebody in who would build the department. And they brought in Bernie Webb, who I've mentioned, Wills B. Webb.
who you said did sleep research, right? That was his thing?
That's what he did in terms of research. Before that, he was in the military, did a lot of, well, he got his PhD with some important people at Iowa. There's some stories there, Kenneth Spence and so on and so forth. He didn't get along. Well, he did okay. But he got his degree at Iowa, and I'm confusing his story with Ed Walker's story, who also was at Iowa for a while. Anyway, Webb was here and began to get a little bit more money and brought in people who were a little bit more accomplished and so on and so forth, and gradually built the department. We were able to get the money for the psychology building, which you know where that is, and he developed it pretty well. And then, I don't remember the exact years, that he then retired as chair and became a research professor. And we brought in a fellow named Merle Meyer from Western Washington. And Merle was a very good department chair. Mm-hmm. He was so-so researcher, but he really ran the department, organized it in terms of these 6 areas, brought in new people. We moved into the new building, and things really started hopping under his administration. Mm. And I think that was an important time in the development of the department. He went, in 1980, he went out for a sabbatical, went over to Europe, and there were a couple people who would like to be acting chair, and the fear was they were not always popular with the faculty. So I got drafted to be the acting chair while he was gone for a semester. Mm. And there were some interesting stories there too, of what people would try to do in terms of, it's just the acting chair, I can push him around and so on. Well, you got to push back sometimes. And so that was an interesting experience.
What would people do in the sense of like pushing you, like what does that entail, like pushing you around? Like what was...
They want to get space, more space. I mean, space is always a big thing. I mean, what does the department have to offer? Mm. Space is a big thing that you can, and so there was some of that. There was a little bit of controversy. I got involved at a time when, it's getting to the race issue, we had one woman who was black and was not regarded as a top professor. And when our existing chair went, I was told, and it's one of my big mistakes, I was told that she would not be rehired. But I was not to tell her why. I was not to tell her that was the edict from the dean's office. Well, that put me in a bad position. Mm. I'm supposed to tell this one of the few black professors we have, she's not going to be hired, but I'm not supposed to tell her why. And I stuck with that. She was really angry at me. Mm. She went over to the dean's office and so on and so forth. She was an average professor. She wasn't great, but yeah, whatever. I don't know what I would have done if I was the real chair there, but the decision was made not to hire her. Mm. And so I was stuck in this position of, she thought I was a racist, I guess, or something. I didn't regard her any different from anybody else, but the decision was made, she would not be hired. Well, so you get stuck in that position. So.
You had to do the dean's dirty work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have done that. It was, in retrospect, I should have just, if you're going to do it, you do it.
Yeah.
I was younger at that time. It was 40 years ago, whatever. So.
Mm. I'm curious with the creation of the psychology building, because I remember you said that there was like, or there are, I don't know if there are, I haven't been to I've seen the outside of the building, but you said that there were places for animals and things like that.
Right.
Were the faculty involved in the design or like the architecture of the building at all in terms of what would be included?
Yeah, one of our faculty members, Hank Pennypacker, really designed most of it. Mm. Now, a little bit you need to know about the psychology department. The psychology department, and I have not prepared this in terms of dates and so on, but at one point, let's say early 60s, they decided that the clinical program and the experimental programs couldn't get along together very well. And so they founded a new department, the Department of Clinical Psychology, in the College of Health-Related Professions down the hill. And so there's a lot of confusion about the differences between those two. Basically, the clinical department is clinical. Our department decided, well, we have to do some of that too, so we have an area of counseling psychology, which is related but not as clinical as the clinical program. And so they butted off, and they've probably been more successful in some ways than the psychology department, to be honest about it. But there's that history there, which I think is important. And I've lost my train of thought because I think this is the key to the whole thing. But you wanted to ask me, what were you asking me about?
I was asking about the architecture and the design.
Oh, yeah, okay,
of the...
yeah. So of course they moved down there. And there were already some of them down in the health center anyway. And then the 6 areas negotiated for space. And there was, of course, we had a year there where there was a chair who was not good. We brought in a chair before Meyer, and he didn't last the whole year. And so it was and that was right as we were moving. So everybody had to get their space and so on and so forth. The 4th floor is animal psychology, animal research, and we got moved out to the new facility out on Archer Road, which was good in many respects. We didn't have to go back and forth to campus all the time, so on and so forth. And I got a lot of space. I did very well there. And of course, Merle was supportive of our research. And so, and then we had the basement was unfinished. So it was really 3 floors plus the animal on the 4th floor. And then eventually they founded a dental school. And they needed space while they were building it. And so a deal was made where the dental school would have the ground floor, the basement, and they could finish it as they wanted. And then when they got their facility for a new dental school, we would get that space. And so that was a big deal. It was good for us and good for them. They had some place to sit when they founded the school, and then we got the space after that.
And so did they pay like the department for the construction or the college? I think the college deals with that. Yeah,
I don't know. It's really above the college, different colleges. So I don't know who paid for what and so on. I tried to stay out of administration as much as I could most of the time. I was reluctant to take the job as acting chair, but I think this department supported me because they knew I would never be a candidate. I would not want that job. I don't like administration. Well, I like it. I'll do some of it. But you have a responsibility to do some of it.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to be a career administrator.
They knew you didn't want to. They knew you weren't going to like launch a coup or something to stick around in the position.
That's right.
I'm curious too, in like your time as teaching and being a professor and things like that. Were there any students of yours that you became particularly attached to?
I didn't have sex with any of them.
Oh well, not in that way. I mean, like just like.
Yeah, my best student was a fellow named Wade Pickren. And he was the really only student I had in history of psychology. He was in clinical psychology, took my course and sort of liked the stuff, and worked in that area, and has become very successful in the history of psychology. He worked for the American Psychological Association for a while, and then a couple of other universities in United States and Canada, and he has done very well. There's some others who did well, but I don't think I had any real stars and so on and so forth who, were APA presidents or anything. Well, I guess the other closest one was an undergraduate here, who went off and got his degree at Georgia, I guess, Yale, and he eventually became APA president.
Oh wow. And
he has been very successful and very, very nice to me. I got a nice plaque a couple of years ago for outstanding achievement or whatever it is that I have up on my wall. This is Tony Puente. He was also the first really sort of Latin American kind of psychologist. And he did very well. He wasn't my graduate student, but he's, in many ways the most distinguished, I guess, of my students.
How do you see or what do you view as your legacy? Not necessarily even at the University of Florida, but in all of your research and things like that. I know you're pretty humble about your accomplishments, but...
Well, I published a whole lot and did a whole lot. Not all of it great, not all of it earth-shaking. I don't think I have any lasting major kinds of things that influenced the world. I had the students. I did a respectable job. I was never... There are people who really were great teachers. I was not a great teacher. I walked in every day. I was prepared. I presented the material that I was supposed to present. But I wasn't one of these really colorful guys that students really love. I was just sort of a guy. And, but I think I did a respectable job of teaching my courses, doing what I was supposed to do. Published a bunch of papers, a whole lot of papers. None of them earth-shaking. But, yeah, I think I did a good job. I'm happy with what I did. With the abilities that I had, I think I used in ways that what I could. I was never going to be a president or anything. But I think I had a good career. I was responsible and accomplished some things. And, but not, no.
But at the end of the day, you still did what you enjoyed. Because I think that's like, at least like in terms of like historians and stuff, one of the things that like I really respect the most among people is when they have like their and they like know pretty much more than anyone else about it. Like for example, with like even the Xerxes facility and things like that.
Right.
Like you are probably the expert on that facility. Like you probably know more than, well, besides maybe Roberta, who you were talking about before, kept such good records.
Yeah, and none of the people who worked there, I mean, I never worked there. So I can't say I knew more than them. I have more of a perspective because I can see the whole show from the beginning to the, I regard as the end. Yerke's lab is still there up in Atlanta, but new directors and so on and so forth. Franz de Waal is associated with it. He's done a lot of work, published many, many books. He's associated with it and so on and so forth, primate research. So I did okay.
All right, well, I guess like my last question is going to be then, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to mention in the interview or anything like that?
We didn't get to do too much in terms of the last years of the laboratory when it was in Florida.
Okay.
And the other directors.
Yeah.
I mentioned briefly Carl Lashley, who was an extremely important psychologist.
Is that Ashley or Lashley?
Lashley.
Okay.
And he was a very severe man in his way, but he was very productive, became an APA president. I guess he was a president, sure. Not sure whether he was a president or not. But he was extremely important in the history of the field. And I think he moved to Florida in part because he loved to sail. And he lived over in Orange Park and had his boat there and so on and so forth. And he eventually married a woman whose father had been at the lab. And she lives in Ocala, runs a wonderful horse farm there. And I got that was one of the people I interviewed, and got some of the nice papers that she had saved from her father, and so on and so forth. And he was very influential and very characteristic man. And then Henry Nissen he died while I was in office. He had some health problems, but he was very important, had a wonderful rapport with chimpanzees that none of the other people had. He's just very good in that respect. And then we had an acting director, and a couple of other people before they went through the whole move to Atlanta, which was, perhaps the most important event in the history of the laboratories when they moved from Orange Park to Atlanta, and all that got involved with the negotiations and so on and so forth, and the establishment of the regional primate facility that the federal government set up. And so that whole transition was an important part.
I'm curious, and I don't know the specific concerns of the people who worked at the laboratory and things like that with your book and the way that things are portrayed, but when you were writing the book, I'm curious how you dealt with, because I'm sure that there were ethical issues involved in some of the ways that maybe the primates were treated or the studies that were done. Do you think that there's how do you handle looking at research that was being done so long ago with, I think the book was published 2006, 2008?
So I think it was 2008, something like that, yeah.
How did you handle looking at things that went on in like the 1930s with like 2008 eyes?
2006. Well, you do it the way you have to do it. I mean, that was the way it was viewed at that time. You can't criticize people of that era for not doing it the way you do it. And things change over time. And perspectives change over time. So that's the only way you can handle it, I think. I don't know what else you could do.
Kind of, like you said, just being objective about the whole thing, kind of understanding where those people were coming from and things like that.
The best I can. Now, it may not be completely objective. I've got my own bias. I'm reflecting the way I view things and use it, not the word I want, but trying to interpret what they did in terms of my values, and they're going to be different.
Yeah.
And what I did is going to be viewed differently in a few years. It already is, I guess.
I'm also curious too, because I remember one of the early questions that you had when you said you were starting to research. I just recalled this in us talking in terms of like why animals, like why use animals or why study animal behaviors to learn more about humans. Did you ever like come to an answer to that question? Like, is there like an early example of when we started trying to use animals to understand more about ourselves or our psychology?
Yeah. I don't think there's a simple answer. Obviously, I've dealt with that many times. If you're studying psychology, why are you studying animals? Well, I just got interested in it when I was in school. Doug Candlin at Bucknell and so on and so forth. And really Wendell Smith, when I first went in there and was trying to get out of chemistry and where am I going to go, it sort of was a natural transition. And I sort of studied it, and it happened to be in psychology. That was okay. There wasn't really a remarkable thing. I didn't want to solve the problems of the world. I was interested in social issues, so on and so forth. But I don't think I had the temperament to really work in that area and work on those things. I was comfortable with this area. I felt I was doing worthwhile things, and that's pretty much it.
And dealing with animals instead of humans.
Yeah. I never wasn't the kind of person who grew up loving animals and having pets all over the place. And so
I was just about to ask.
Right. We had dogs in the family and so on and so forth when I was growing up, but I wasn't one of those kids that's always got all kinds of animals. That wasn't me.
I'm trying to think. I can't really think of any more questions. So
good. I'm getting hungry.
Okay. Well, perfect. I guess I'll end the interview there. Nothing else that you want to talk about, right?
Not really.
Okay.
There's a lot of things I could talk about, but I could go on for days. But
your hunger is more pertinent.
Yeah.
All right. I will end the interview.